Hello again. This lecture is entitled Public Goods and the Origins and Purposes of Government. Because government rules, regulations, and symbols are always around us from birth until death, we don't often stop to ask the question, why is all of this necessary? We often complain about this or that restriction, but we rarely question the need for some restrictions, some enforcement mechanism, in a word, some non-voluntary sectors of human society. And yet, in most areas where we want something, we can find ready suppliers willing to, for a price, give us the things that we need, like food, shelter, transport, and so on and so forth. In fact, people are usually very skeptical of monopolies with their high prices and lack of service. Think about your local cable company for a minute. But in matters governmental, people accept the government's monopoly on the issuance of rules, on currency, on law enforcement, on adjudication, and incarceration. But why is there no market for protection services from criminals? Why is there no competition between courts to offer the quickest and fairest resolution to commercial or criminal disputes? Why don't individuals get to individually decide what set of legal rules they want to live by and let other people decide the same? Of course, in that sort of system, each legal system would also need rules about how to deal with people from other legal systems, but of course, that's exactly what our current system of international law does. Now, the question, why have government, admits of a range of answers, and some people, we call them anarchists, struggle to come up with any satisfactory answer whatsoever to the question. Political philosophers will tell you that some things involving questions of justice, are inappropriate to be left to the vagaries of the free market, and certainly that is one plausible answer. Political scientists and economists, though, are more interested in what people do than what people ought to do, and so they generally answer a question in a different sort of way. Some goods and services, they say, are simply not well provided by the marketplace. They have characteristics such that private providers, such as individual firms or organizations, find it difficult or even impossible to make a profit selling them in the open market, and this despite the fact that there is a large consumer base willing and able to pay for it. Of course, it's not mysterious why producers find it very difficult to sell shoddy or expensive products on the market, and nobody wants to buy them. It is more compelling and more puzzling why organizations and firms are not able to offer products that everybody does in fact want when on an open market. Now, if people want those goods to be provided in sufficient quality and quantity, they are going to have to find another way of getting supply to meet demand. The market just won't do. And I think justice is definitely one of these goods that the market will undersupply. We could also look at other examples like national defense, environmental protection, law enforcement, criminal adjudication, that is to say trial processes, currency stability, right? So the value of the money that doesn't inflate or deflate too rapidly. And many others are considered paradigmatic cases of what political scientists call public goods. So we have government because, in theory at least, it offers the promise of giving us goods and services that we want that the marketplace is unable to supply in sufficient quantity or quality. These things are called public goods. There is, in other words, a demand for government, just like there is a demand for ordinary goods like cheese, beer, or small devices that rotate rapidly between your thumb and index finger. That seems to be popular right now. So where do things go wrong? If our acceptance of government originates in the human species' innate drive for self-improvement and progress, why do governments so often fall short of our expectations? Now, this is a question that could take an entire course to answer, but some of the problems are clear and familiar. Sometimes, the government appears to be failing from the point of view of individual citizens, but is actually succeeding from the perspective of the welfare of the group as a whole. In these cases, private and public interests diverge. There's always a subset of society that might be better off if the government were to do something else. But that doesn't mean that from the point of view of society as a whole, the government is not in fact doing the best job that it possibly can. So sometimes, at least, when citizens complain about the government, they are complaining that the government is not catering to their private interests, but is instead catering to the public interest, which happens to discount their private interests in some way. In other cases, powerful individuals come to control government and end up using the organs of government for their private purposes rather than public purposes. Now, you can call these conflicts between private and public interest. As we will see, some of this, political scientists call them agency problems, is probably inevitable. It is always the case that someone working for the government, a judge, a bureaucrat, or a politician, will have private interests and public interests, and that those things will conflict. In some cases, their position will allow them to privilege their private interests over the public interest, and it will be too costly or impossible to do very much about that. Now, in addition to conflicts between private and public interests, there are also conflicts of private interests. In this case, we have individuals who want the government to take their side in a dispute and are willing to apply various sorts of pressure to the government to make that happen. Now, these aren't people trying to take over government, but they're simply people who are trying to use it as a tool to achieve their private ends. Let's look at some examples of this. We might think of labor conflicts, where both labor unions on the one side and representatives of business on the other side lobby governments to try and create a regulatory framework that favors them in a particular dispute. Regulatory capture might be a more general case of this happening, where you have an industry or one particular player in industry that tries to lobby the set of folks who are regulating that industry, usually some government agency, and to try and put rules in place that make it easier for them to make money and make it harder for their competitors to make money. Licensing might be a form of this in a way. If you can make it difficult for your competitors to enter the market, you can capture a larger share of its profits. Farm subsidies are often given an example of this. Tariff barriers are another. These are all examples of one set of the public, or one subset of the public, trying to use government to a specific private advantage. Now, in addition to conflicts of interest, you also have moral conflicts. Conflicts between different moral values, including different perspectives on what the appropriate role of government is. The state might certainly be necessary to provide some range of goods and services, but some might think that there are solid moral reasons for the state to do more than this minimum necessary. There might be moral reasons, questions of justice, that would not be well satisfied by allowing those goods and services to be provided by the market. It seems obvious now, by now, that it is certainly possible for us to have a system of private prisons, but many people find private incarceration to be morally inappropriate and sometimes ineffective as well. Other people look at it the opposite way. Just because that some things are only necessary, or some things must necessarily be provided by government if they are to be provided at all, does not mean that it is necessary for the government to provide them. So they might think that just because the only way to set up, say, a welfare state would be to use a government to provide it, does not mean that we should set up a welfare state. Like agency problems, moral conflict about the appropriate purposes of the state is probably inevitable in free societies. When people grow up in free societies, they tend to naturally come to different conclusions about the proper size and scope of government. And finally, there are perhaps more boring disagreements. We may call technical disagreements. Disagreements about the facts, about to what degree one particular public good or service really is a public good. And there might be more general disagreements about the relative capacities of the market or government to provide a good. Now, these aren't conflicts of interest, and these aren't conflicts of moral values, but disagreements of judgment about what the best way to provide certain goods, like healthcare or education or what have you. And because technology and organizational knowledge, that is to say, knowledge about how to organize personnel and technology and capital within an organization, because these things are constantly evolving, what used to be impossible might now actually be possible. And what used to be the best way and most cost-effective way of providing a good or service is now no longer the best way. And so people have debates about how much the government should do and what it should do, simply because of disagreements of judgment. So in conclusion, many economists and political scientists highlight the fact that there are some goods and services that have characteristics that make them difficult or even impossible to provide by the market. These are called public goods. I've posted some accompanying videos on the course website for a more full treatment of exactly what a public good is. However, government organizations can and do go beyond public goods in the types of activities they engage in. When they do more or when they do less than what the public wants, usually this is a product of certain kinds of government failure. Perhaps, or actually not only government failure, right? It could be a product of public misperception. It could involve an agency problem. It could be a conflict of interest. It could be a conflict of moral values, or it could be simply a hard question. It could be some factual uncertainty, differences in judgment about what is necessary. Once we better understand the challenges which government attempts to answer, we're going to be in a better position to think about how to design government institutions and processes that best meet these challenges.